The Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, is one of the conventions established during the historic 1992 Rio Earth Summit alongside the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC for short. While the CBD is a sister convention to the UNFCCC, it is much less commonly talked about, especially here in Singapore. But today, that changes. The CBD has three main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. Together, these objectives guide the convention towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature.
So you might be asking, why do I need to know all about this? Well, biodiversity is the basis for ecosystem services, which are quantifiable benefits provided to humans by ecosystems. These services are not only essential to human health and well-being, but are also a major contributor to many economies. For example, ecosystems directly provide resources which humans use, such as timber production or fisheries for food production. Pollination is also an economically significant ecosystem service, directly supporting crop production worldwide. These services are all dependent on the healthy functioning of ecosystems, which would be very costly or nearly impossible to replicate if ever lost. According to a report published by the World Economic Forum, about 44 trillion, over half of the world's GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on ecosystem services and is therefore threatened given rising rates of biodiversity loss. Much of this is attributed to human activities such as deforestation or over-harvesting of natural resources. Singapore, too, is dependent on ecosystem services. Locally, our parks and green spaces provide recreational spaces for us to relax and are essential for our mental well-being. They also help with cooling our concrete jungle. Internationally, we depend on the healthy functioning of ecosystem services in countries where we import our food and raw materials from. If these ecosystems are lost, we might see rising prices in the cost of living as a result. Biodiversity loss is therefore not just an ecological problem, but an economic problem as well, and one that impacts everyone.
So, how does the CBD actually work? Every decade, countries will come together and collectively decide on a framework to guide biodiversity policies for the next 10 years. One such example is the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, which were the global targets from 2011 to 2020. Governments then create national targets based on these global frameworks as detailed in their National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plan, or otherwise known as NBSAPs for short. These are freely available online, including Singapore's. NBSAPs usually also include detailed explanations on how each country will contribute to the achievement of the global framework. These national targets are meant to be achieved and are intended to guide biodiversity policymaking in their respective countries. They're quite similar to the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs for short, of the UNFCCC. Every few years, governments are also tasked to provide status updates on the implementation progress of the NBSAPs, which are then detailed in the national report submitted to the CBD Secretariat.
The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or KMGBF for short, was established in 2022 at CBD COP15, held in Montreal, Canada. It's intended to guide policymaking up until 2030, where the next framework will be adopted. It comprises 23 different targets across 4 main goals, which directly mirror the 3 objectives of the CBD. The first 8 targets deal with biodiversity conservation, supporting the first objective of the CBD, conservation of biological diversity. The next 5 targets collectively support the second and third objectives of the CBD, relating to sustainable use of biodiversity alongside fair and equitable benefit sharing. The final 10 targets are the means of implementation. These targets support and enable the implementation of the previous 13. They discuss everything from conservation finance to the use of technology to stakeholder engagement and more. Of special note here is Target 14, Mainstreaming Biodiversity. This target pushes for nature-related considerations to be integrated into a wide variety of policies within and across all sectors and government agencies, acknowledging that everyone has a stake in nature conservation, even sectors traditionally not associated with conservation.
The first three targets of the KMGBF collectively aims to halt biodiversity loss by transforming our approaches to managing both land and sea spaces. These targets focus on integrating biodiversity considerations into spatial planning while rehabilitating degraded ecosystems across various landscapes. Target 3, also one of the more well-known targets of the KMGBF, is also known as the 30 by 30 target to conserve at least 30% of freshwater, land, and marine areas by 2030. Currently, 17% of land and 8% of marine spaces are protected, so this is quite an ambitious goal. But how can these targets be measured? Well, area is a reliable indicator to start with, but can be much more useful when you add measurements of habitat condition and quality, ecological connectivity across a landscape, protections for endangered species across their range, and many more. However, these targets cannot be achieved without the active engagement and participation of a diverse range of stakeholders, including indigenous peoples and local communities, which may be affected by these conservation decisions. Considerations for ecological connectivity also needs to be made at a more upstream planning level to ensure the restoration and conservation efforts reach their full potential. Together, they seek to enhance ecosystem resilience, promote sustainable practices, and safeguard critical habitats to ensure the preservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services for future generations.
Target 11 and 12 aims to improve humans' relationship with nature and biodiversity through a variety of measures. Target 11 in particular discusses ecological functions, services, and their benefits to humans. It also highlights ecosystem-based approaches as potential strategies to mitigate and adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change. Target 12 complements this well with an emphasis on improving human access to these services, particularly in urban areas, which can positively impact human well-being. These targets also make note that considerations for biodiversity should not be compromised in this process, thereby ensuring both nature and society benefits from these outcomes. A thorough evaluation of different kinds of ecosystem services, regulating, supporting, provisional, and cultural, would be useful to consider. If you're interested to learn more about how much of our lives are made possible through healthy, functioning ecosystems, even though we don't realize it, I highly recommend you to check out the 2019 Global Assessment Report published by Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, known as IPES.
This target primarily deals with corporate accountability through tackling greenwashing and empowering consumers to make informed decisions about their impact on biodiversity. It also calls for transparent reporting, encouraging businesses to take stock of nature-related risks and opportunities in their portfolios and value chains, thereby providing them with a greater understanding of the value of biodiversity to the sustainability of their business. This is one way we can encourage the mainstreaming of biodiversity under Target 14 and include considerations for nature and potentially even open the doors to conservation initiatives in areas where it traditionally has not been a priority. Implementation of this target would involve tools like the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures or TNFD framework unveiled at the end of last year, which provide a set of recommendations to businesses keen to explore how their impact on biodiversity could also impact their business model in the future and therefore mobilize more action from the private sector into the future. This leads very nicely into our next set of targets for closing the global biodiversity funding gap. The 2020 Paulson Institute report on financing nature looked at current funding flows for conservation efforts and estimates that these funds are sufficient to cover less than 20% of the required costs to effectively halt biodiversity loss. The funding gap is estimated to be around US $700 billion per year by 2030. Here's where the KMGBF comes into play. Target 18 calls for the identification and phasing out of subsidies that harm biodiversity, such as production or consumer subsidies. The idea is that the money not spent on activities harming biodiversity could therefore count as avoided losses. As these habitats and the ecosystem services they provide remain intact, precious funds for conservation need not be spent to restore and protect those habitats and can be prioritized elsewhere. The money saved from cutting back on these subsidies can even be repurposed to incentivize biodiversity-friendly practices. One example could be rolling back agricultural subsidies supporting slash and burn tactics and instead supporting farms with more sustainable practices such as agroforestry or regenerative agriculture, among others. In this way,
Target 18 hopes to eliminate, phase out, reform, and reduce these subsidies by at least US 500 billion annually. The remaining US 200 billion is expected to come from innovative funding mechanisms set up under Target 19, which include but are not limited to blended finance schemes, biodiversity impact funds leveraging on private finance, supporting carbon projects with biodiversity co-benefits, payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, and many other benefit sharing mechanisms. These targets also call for parties to invest more in developing countries and emphasize the need for transparent, efficient, and effective mechanisms for resource mobilization. All these mechanisms must also consider active participation and engagement from a diverse group of stakeholders.
This topic is our final set of targets, which is target 21 to 23. These collectively call for the best available data and information to be made accessible for all potential stakeholders, who can be fairly represented and empowered to participate in decision making. These stakeholders include, but are not limited to, women and girls, children and youth, persons with disability, indigenous people and local communities, members of the general public, policymakers, academics, consultants, developers, and more. We hope that the inclusion of opinions from diverse communities can lead to more robust and inclusive policies regarding the management and stewardship of biodiversity, leading to more effective implementation of conservation initiatives. One of these stakeholders will be us, the youth. It is important for us to be involved in advocacy and speaking up for biodiversity. As the next generation of leaders, we will face long-term consequences of today's decision. And so the future loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services will impact us the most. This is the idea of intergenerational equity, which demands that decisions made today do not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Our involvement today would allow us to both gain valuable experience, allow us to make informed decisions, and avoid repeating mistakes of the past. We bring to the negotiation table a unique yet valuable set of perspectives and can play important roles in the implementation of these policies. The world is taking notice of the power of youth too. Our inclusion in Target 22 of the KMGBF means there exists the mandate for our involvement and an opportunity for us to have a say in the choices of tomorrow, so that we don't make the same mistakes of yesterday. If you're interested to learn more about biodiversity, policy, advocacy, and how we work, consider joining our team.
Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. So I shot and edited this video, and if you want to join us to do stuff like this in media production, event coverage, because you like to do photography, or you want to hold guided walks because you want to share your knowledge of nature with people, or you simply just want to learn more, you can check out our website. It's in the description below this video. There'll be a link there, and we'll see you next time.